Hey guys, what's going on? This is Andrew here today, and we're going to be looking at my controllers once again, but this time we're going to be ranking them from my least favorite controller all the way to my favorite controller. And in this video, we're going to be covering my modern controllers, so basically from the 360 all the way to the PS5. I'm not going to be looking at any of the controllers before that yet, but I may jump into those in a separate video. Not sure when exactly I'm going to do that. So basically, as I said before, this video will go from 360 all the way to PS5, and the controllers that I won't be including are the Wii U Pro Controller, the gamepad, or the Nintendo Switch Pro Controller, because the Switch Pro Controller is something you have to buy separate, the Wii Pro Controller is something you have to buy separate, and the gamepad speaks for itself as my least favorite controller to hold because it's a big ass thing. So that's already my least favorite I've ever played on, but besides that, guys, let's jump right into the video. So to start off with the controllers, obviously besides for the Wii U gamepad, my least favorite controller has to be to something that's technically a console, but one that also failed years ago, the Ouya Controller. So basically this is like an Xbox 360 knockoff kind of controller. What they basically did was just rename the buttons, but they're color-coded the exact same way as they were on the Xbox, so it's Ouya, spelling Ouya on the controller. This controller itself really is just not comfortable in the hands. The triggers don't feel good at all. I talked about this in my last video. The bumpers don't feel great either. The only thing I can say is quite decent, or maybe the clickiness of the actual front buttons itself, and the clickiness of the joysticks. But the thing with the joysticks is they feel kind of slippery. They feel like they're going to fall right out of my hands, and honestly, this is just not a good controller altogether. The D-pad is also feels like it'll break if you use it too hard. But yeah, not a great controller, not a great start. I'm going to put this one to the side, and when I figure out how to connect any other controllers to my Ouya, I'm going to do that right away. Next controller on the list is going to be the Sony PS3 controller. So, believe it or not, I actually prefer the PS2 controller, despite it being very similar. There are very, very subtle differences between the controllers, but this one has to be my least favorite main console controller, I have to say, just because it's not that it's a bad controller altogether. It doesn't fit well in my hands, in my opinion. The way I play is kind of like where my thumbs are like shifting a lot during gameplay, and sometimes if I bring these sticks together, I'll end up like clicking my thumbs together, and I don't like how close the sticks are. And everything else about this controller is alright. I mean, the buttons feel great. All the buttons on here are fine. The only other thing I don't like on this controller are the triggers on the back of it. Never was a fan of these triggers on the PS2 controller either. Obviously, they're basically the same, but never was a fan of them. The only good thing that I love about this controller, above all other controllers, I'd have to say, are probably the L1 and R1 buttons, just because they're nice and clicky and they don't feel like they're going to break down. You can basically just like spam these things and never feel like they're going to die on you. So, not a fan of this controller 100%, but there are things that I do really like about it, and there are some of those things that were brought over to the Ps4 controller that I liked. Alright, so one weird controller that I'm going to be putting above the PS3 controller, some of you guys may disagree with this wholeheartedly, I have to put the Wii Remote as above that controller, just because I actually enjoy this controller quite a lot. Whenever a game was done right to support this controller, this was a great controller. I mean, it was a great controller for Wii Sports. I loved playing the Lego games on these, and my favorite game to play on the Wii with this controller had to be The Force Unleashed. I mean, just being able to swing it around while also connecting a nunchuck to it and all that stuff, this really can be a versatile controller. You can do a lot of different things on this controller. You can play it like with classic games, you can play it with modern games. There's a ton of homebrew games that still come out on the Wii, so you can really use this controller for a lot of things. Honestly, I love it. It's not my favorite controller in the world, but it is a very versatile controller that I feel like if someone were to hand it to me while I was at a tournament or something, I wouldn't really complain. Alright, the next controller on my list has to be the Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons. So I kind of consider these controllers the sequel to the Wii Remote, just because I feel like they did a lot of the same things that they did in the Wii Remote, but seriously made these a lot better to where you didn't really need to have a ton of add-ons or any extra things plugged in to make it feel like you had the all-in-one controller. What I like about these is there is motion sensors in both of them. The rumble on these feel great. These honestly do feel comfortable in the hands, and sometimes when I'm tired at night, I just want to chill and play a relaxing video game. Sometimes I'll sit like this, You know, just simply like that. One controller right here, one controller right here, and I can just feel like I'm chilling out without having to hold my arms like this. It honestly is a really good idea for a controller, and honestly, the way I find myself playing these controllers the most, actually, are through the Joy-Con grip. I do have a GameCube controller now that I play on instead of these, but back then, this really was not a bad experience just having these in the Joy-Con grip. The reason this would be a little bit lower down on my list, though, is because in the grip, it definitely doesn't feel as good as if you had a regular controller. I mean, everything is kind of small, and one thing I have to take off for the Joy-Cons, the buttons are extremely small. Not that it's the worst thing in the world, but it definitely makes this a little lower on my list than some of the other controllers I'm going to be listing, but great controller altogether. I think Nintendo did a great job making these Joy-Cons for the system. I wish they would have made the Switch Lite have the Joy-Cons as detachable controllers rather than having it all basically baked into the system. Allergies are bad again, guys, so sorry about the sniffling. Alright, next controller on my list has to go to the Xbox One original controller. So this isn't 100% the original controller. It still has the same kind of stuff that you would see in one. The original Xbox One controller, the reason I'm distinguishing this one from the One S controller is because the One S controller added some features that the original Xbox One controller just didn't have. So basically, this controller connected only to the Xbox One and wasn't able to connect to anything else unless you connected it to a PC, but you couldn't connect it wirelessly without some kind of Xbox One dongle. This didn't have the same kind of Bluetooth capabilities of the Xbox One S controller or the Series X controller. So this one also had much less clicky bumpers. It was much harder, I remember when I first got this controller, to press this button down. I'm feeling it's a little easier as I've put more wear and tear into the controller, but I really was not a big fan of this controller when it first came out. I thought it felt bulky. I thought that it honestly just had a weird feel to it. I just felt like it was quite a downgrade from the Xbox 360 controller. That's my opinion, honestly. I do think that the triggers were a step up. I really did like the triggers on these controllers, and I thought the buttons were good, the D-pad was good, but the thing that really turned me off from this controller really had to be the RB and the LB buttons. They just do not feel good at all, so I had to put this controller down there. It does feel good in the hands nowadays as I play it more, but back then, I really just could not stand this controller, and I really wished that back then there would have been a 360 to Xbox One controller converter, because I really just did not like that controller for a long time. Next on my list, the PS5 DualSense. You guys are probably going to be pretty surprised that this is this low on my list, but it is, it has to be. It's really not one of my favorite, well, it's one of my favorite controllers, but it's honestly not like my top 3 favorite controllers. To be honest, I preferred the PS4 controller over this one a ton. This controller feels a little heavy to me. I liked the PS4 controller a lot better because it was much more lightweight. This basically has everything that a PS4 controller would have, but then you got, you know, when you're playing a game that doesn't take advantage of the adaptive triggers, it really just doesn't feel that great, to be honest. And I do like the bumpers just like I like them on the PS4, but honestly, this controller just feels too bulky. It feels weird in my hands, and it's just not my favorite controller to hold. When I'm playing PS4 games on the PS5, I normally use my PS4 controller that way, and I really wish they would have supported the PS4 controller in PS5 games, just because, like I said multiple times now, not my favorite controller. Alright, the next controller on my list has to be the Xbox 360 controller. So I almost consider this a perfect controller. It was almost perfect, but there are very little things that honestly stood out to me to make me not have this as my favorite controller. It does feel great in the hands, don't get me wrong, it's an amazing feeling controller. This was my main controller that I used for years, on PC especially. When I had my Xbox One, I was using the 360 controller with the wireless game receiver instead of using an Xbox One controller on there, just because I felt like this was that much better. The things I have to take off about this controller specifically have to be the battery back. This thing is very delicate. You drop it on a hardwood floor, you are cracking this thing, and unfortunately, this is what holds the batteries in place. So if this is not like perfectly in place, this thing will eventually just like make the controller keep losing power, and you have to keep pushing it hard and pushing it back into place, and even sometimes just taking it off and on a bunch of times over the years, this thing will eventually wear out to where you're going to have to tape the backs. There are about 3 controllers in my basement that we've had to tape up to make sure this stays into place, and unfortunately that's just how it goes. The next thing I have to point out are the bumpers on this thing. I do like the clickiness of them and everything, how they feel in most games, but unfortunately in intensified games where you need to use these for faster inputs, like Guitar Hero, for example, the Guitar Hero series, these can tend to be very delicate. You can break these pretty easily. I was using the controller for a very long time before I got my Xbox 360 guitar, so basically these wore out really fast on most of my controllers, which made me have to open them up and replace some of the parts for them, unfortunately. I love the triggers and everything, great controller in that regard, but these are very delicate, and my least favorite thing about this controller has to be the D-pad. This can get stuck pretty easily, unfortunately, and it can make games hard to play if you're constantly using the D-pad in that regard. But everything else about this controller I do really like. Those are really the only things about this controller that I don't like, and that's why it's pretty low on my list, because there's a lot of problems with this controller, but there's also a lot of good things about it. And honestly, if they continued using this controller by just fixing the back and the D-pad, I probably wouldn't have complained ever again for the rest of my life about a controller like this. Alright, so the next on my list is going to be the Xbox One S controller. As mentioned before, I felt like this was a much major upgrade over the standard Xbox One controller, because they really did add a few features to this that made me like it a lot better. So the first thing had to be the Bluetooth compatibility with everything else. So basically, you didn't need an Xbox wireless receiver to connect this to a PC. You could just use a simple Bluetooth dongle. You can connect this to any Bluetooth device. You can connect this to your phone as well for a phone gamepad, which is what I actually mainly use this for nowadays. And it works on even the Xbox Series X and all the other Xbox One consoles. It's a great controller in my opinion, everything about this. Other things that they added have to be the better RB and LB buttons. On the Xbox One controller, as I said, they felt very stiff. They weren't very easy to press. These are much easier to press. They weren't very delicate. You can do some harder games on this thing and not feel like they're about to break on you. Honestly, great triggers. Just everything about this controller is very similar to the Xbox One controller with those little things added. Plus, they also added the headphone jack for support for other headsets that are not just only Xbox One specific. I'm happy that they kept the Xbox One headset specific port on there though. That way, if you did buy those headsets, you were able to use them on this controller. So they also included it on the Xbox Series X controller. So way to go, Microsoft. Good job. Honestly, great controller. My top 3 controllers of all time. Probably always will be unless Microsoft decides to make an even better one. So number 2 on my list has to be the controller that came out, well, after that. The Xbox Series X controller. This one was actually an upgrade over the Xbox One S controller as well. A major upgrade, should I add, in my opinion. You can barely see it on the screen because my terrible camera quality, and plus this is black. But honestly, this feels so much better in the hands. Whatever they did to kind of go around the edges, around the corners to make this fit better, they did an incredible job. This really is one of my favorite controllers ever. This is my second favorite controller that I've ever played, and just the little things added on here were much better. And on top of that, they actually added better LB and RB buttons. So for intensified games with those kind of buttons being used, this really is a great controller. This, not to mention, this is backwards compatible with your Xbox One console, and you can use this on PC as well, and you can use it on mobile. So basically everything that was in the Xbox One S controller, they upgraded and made even better on this controller. Plus the share button that they added on there, which I felt like they should have done in the first place on the older controllers. And like I said before, they even have the Xbox One headset backwards compatibility, the Xbox One specific headsets, while also adding the headphone jack. So this is basically the Xbox One S controller on steroids. In my opinion, it feels much better. I would love to use this controller forever if for some reason Microsoft makes another controller that I don't like for their next console. Alright guys, so the last controller on my list that I'm going to talk about, which is my favorite controller of all time, also paired with my favorite console of all time, the Ps4 controller. So this is the original Ps4 controller, not the exact model, because this is the Black Ops 3 limited edition controller that came with my limited edition PS4, but this feels exactly like a original PS4 controller, and I consider this basically a perfect controller. The only thing I would change is the left analog stick to be where the D-pad is, and the D-pad to be where the left analog stick would be. So the reason why I feel like this is almost a perfect controller is because it's got really nice triggers on it. The L1 and R1 buttons on here feel perfect. The D-pad feels great. They fixed the spacing between the joysticks Unlike on the PS3 controller where they were much closer, these are much further apart, so you're less likely to be hitting your thumbs together, even if you have big hands. The buttons are nice and responsive. I really like the touchpad on this controller. Honestly, this controller is my favorite of all time, and it might be my favorite forever if Sony keeps making heavy controllers. I really like how lightweight this controller feels compared to the DualSense, and honestly, like I said before, I prefer playing this on my PS5 when there are PS4 games that I'm playing on there, because the PS5 controller, like I said before, is a little heavy and hurts my hand after a while. So, favorite controller of all time, that's all I really have to say about that controller. Alright guys, so those are all the modern controllers that I can think of. I don't know if you guys are going to agree with all these controllers on my list and how I feel about them, but that's how I feel in my opinion. When it comes to controllers, they really do add to the experience. In my opinion, you can't have a good gaming experience without a good controller. A great example is having a huge Steam library and then going and getting the Steam controller. That one I have tried before, never really got into it, and I never got it for myself because I felt like it would be a complete waste to do so. I love the Nintendo 64 and the games on there, but I can't stand the controller to this day, and that is the reason why I really don't play the Nintendo 64 that much, just because I can't stand the controller. I would eventually like to get one of those knockoff controllers that makes it feel like a more modern controller, because then at that point I think I will play the N64 a little bit more. But for now guys, the PS4 controller is my favorite controller, and that's what I have to say about controllers. Thank you guys for watching this video. I will see you all in the next one.